We'll just start in another 2-3 minutes while when we yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Thank you for joining us. Today's topic is sustainability in advertising, redefining the future of marketing. My name is Maitri, and joining me is Tai, and we are thrilled to be your hosts for this insightful discussion. Today, we are honored to have with us Brian Murphy, a leading expert at the intersection of advertising and sustainability. Brian is the founder of Alpine Project, a climate consultancy that helps advertising companies create and implement their sustainability strategies so they can future proof their businesses and create new revenue opportunities. Brian is a 25-year veteran of the ad tech industry, having held leadership positions at companies such as DoubleClick, Yahoo, and Google. He also led buyer development at OpenX, the first advertising technology company to achieve the SBTI net zero standard. Brian's work on this important initiative inspired him to launch Alpine Project as a way to help other companies in the ad sector launch their climate action plans. He's a graduate of St. Lawrence University and the Yale School of Management's Corporate Sustainability Management program, and he serves as an advisor and working group co-chair with AdNet Zero, the organization focused on the decarbonization of the advertising industry. Before we begin, a quick note. We will have a dedicated Q&A session toward the end of the webinar. If you have any questions during the session, please type them in the chat and Tai will be moderating the chat. We'll do our best to address as many of your questions as possible during the allotted time. And once again, please make sure your microphones are off. We welcome you to turn on your video, but please make sure your microphones are turned off. And with that, let's dive in. Brian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maitri, and thanks also to Stacy and Ty for setting this up. And hello, everybody. It's great to connect with you on what I think is a really important and interesting topic, this intersection of the advertising industry, marketing industry, and environmental sustainability. I think that Maitri did a good job of introducing me, but as she mentioned, I've been in the ad tech space for almost 30 years, having worked for companies like DoubleClick, Yahoo, Google, and as Maitri mentioned, OpenX, which is and was the first company in the ad tech space to meet what's called the SBTI net zero standard. We're going to talk about what that means in a little bit. In my business that I launched about 1.5 years ago, after my experience at OpenX, is called Alpine Project. And we help companies in the advertising, media, and technology space create their sustainability strategies. And we do it right now for mostly companies that want to create a differentiator, or they just really want to do the right thing. They want to have their climate action house in order. But where this is going is regulation and requirements for companies to disclose the environmental impact of their business operations, their greenhouse gas emissions, so as to stay compliant with all the different changes in the regulatory landscape that we're expecting over the next decade or so, both in the US at the state level now and potentially the federal level later on, but certainly in Europe with initiatives like CSRD, which are requiring a lot of companies to actually start to report this data. So we're basically in the business of helping companies in a particular sector just get their environmental house in order. So we're going to cover 3 topics. Topic 1 is let's talk about this intersection of the ad industry and environmental sustainability. What is the environmental impact of advertising? And then second topic is, well, what's the industry doing about it? What action are we as executives and leaders in the ad space actually doing about it? And then we'll turn it back to all of you and talk about if this is something that is of interest to you and you want to get involved, how can you get started? So let's start with the environmental impact of the advertising industry, but even taking a further step out and just look at the environmental impact of business and industry at large. Anytime an organization or a company or any kind of an entity wants to understand its impact on the environment, there are actually standards, guidelines, and protocols in place that have been set for the last 3 decades for how some sort of entity like that can measure its impact on the environment. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which was created in the 90s, is designed to create a reporting template and a methodology for companies to figure out what are the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions of a particular business or organization. Scope 1 emissions being the direct emissions, Scope 2 being indirect emissions largely from purchased energy. And then Scope 3 is your value chain. That is all of the upstream and downstream business partnerships or purchase goods and services you have that all have an impact on your business and also have their own impact on the environment. And if you look at just at a broad scope, where does this get broken down category by category and sector by sector? You can get an idea of a lot of research that's been done to try to figure out what is the environmental impact of different types of businesses. And one business and sector you won't see on here is advertising, because this is still a relatively new concept. But it is now, over the last 2 or 3 years, become one of the most talked about topics in discussions around the ad sector is, well, what about us? What is the impact of our industry on the environment? We don't have factories and warehouses. We're not in the agriculture or forestry industry. So how do we connect the dots between the business operations of companies in our sector and our impact on the environment? So a good way to look at it is, well, let's start with the broader digital economy, because advertising is both a services business, but it's also a very digital business. And if you look at the broader digital economy, everything from streaming to crypto to email to AI, something we can talk about too. And of course, advertising, which is one of the engines that powers the digital economy. Well, if you add it all up, it's responsible for about 3.7% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that is not zero. And it's not one of the larger numbers in that pie chart we showed earlier, but it's not insignificant. It's 3.7% is a lot bigger than most people thought. To put that in comparison, it's bigger than the global aviation industry. So if you look at the data centers that power the digital economy are actually have a bigger impact on the environment than global aviation, it starts to help us understand, okay, this is a bigger deal than we might have previously thought. Now, if you zero in on advertising, well, you think about the creation of advertising, the delivery of advertising, all the ad tech intermediaries that go into powering and ensuring that advertising gets properly distributed and produced and delivered. All of that has its own impact on the environment, because these are all powered by data centers that are largely powered by fossil fuel-based energy sources. Most of you have probably seen a version of this before, but this is what the supply chain looks like. You look at from the one end, which is the advertiser, all the way through to the other end, which is the publisher. There's a massive amount of data transfer that goes into the delivery of an ad from Pepsi onto Yahoo's website or mobile app. And it is all powered by data centers that run all of these individual corporate operations. Every single one of those companies, from the DSPs to the SSPs to the ad servers to the DMPs, they're all powered by data centers, and data centers have to run on electricity that has to come from somewhere. And most of those data centers are powered by fossil fuel-based energy sources. That's how you connect the dots between our industry and our supply chain and that 3.7% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So a couple of years ago, this was not something that anybody in the ad sector was talking about. But now, with this new research that's been done, it's become more apparent that we actually have a bigger impact than we might have thought. And this is one of my, we'll talk about a couple of quotes throughout our conversation today, but one of them, and maybe the one that was most impactful for me, is data centers are the new factories. You just can't see the smoke. It's out of sight, out of mind. Data centers sit in places that we typically don't visit. We don't see the smokestacks. We don't smell the gas burning, but they are absolutely massive, massive consumers of electricity. And that is why our industry has such a big impact on the environment. Okay, so now that we kind of understand the connection between the ad sector and its impact on the environment, what are we doing about it? I'm going to talk about two organizations. The first one is something called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. This was a collaboration of several other nonprofit organizations, CDP, the UN Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and the WWF, back in 2015, created the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, as a way for companies to actually set science-based and meaningful emissions reduction targets. Prior to the SBTI, any company can go out there and say, well, we're going to reduce our emissions by 20% by 2050. And there was no real science behind it. And so now there's a checks and balances system in place. And if you are a company that wants to actually go forth with some sort of a statement or a commitment around emissions reduction, the Science-Based Targets Initiative is the means by which to do so. And as of this week, there's close to 10,000 companies that have joined the Science-Based Targets Initiative and either set targets near term or what are considered to be longer term net zero targets, which is a much more ambitious 90% plus reduction in your emissions from a baseline year. But companies that are setting either short term, near term, or longer term targets, there's now close to 10,000 companies that have done so. Now, what does that have to do with the ad sector? Well, if you look at the biggest ad spending brands, even just the top 25 biggest ad spending brands, 70% of them have all set targets with the Science Based Targets Initiative. That means that big companies like Procter & Gamble and Unilever and Pfizer and GM, they've all set these big targets. And if you look carefully at the targets, there's scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, which includes scope 3 emissions that come from your value chain. If you are in the value chain, if you are doing business with any one of these companies, you are part of their value chain, and therefore your emissions are part of their scope 3 emissions, which is why this reverberates throughout the entire industry. These companies cannot hit their targets on their own. They need to have collaboration with all the companies in their value chains in order to do so. Okay, so those are the companies that spend the money, but when you look at the ad agencies, right? I think most of you probably know that the vast majority of global ad spend comes through 5 or 6 of the big agency holding companies. They've all set science-based targets as well, which means that their value chains include all of the ad tech platforms, all of the publishers, all the ad servers, all the production companies. They're all in the value chains of these brands and the agencies that represent them, which means that this is not something that's going to be contained to just these big corporations. It's going to impact everybody. And if you look at some of the targets that have been set by these agencies, you get to see very specifically. You can go onto the SBTI website, sciencebasedtargets.org, and you can actually see which agency is setting what kind of a target off of what sort of a baseline year at what point in the future. And it's really interesting to see from agency to agency, company to company, who's setting targets and who's setting more ambitious versus less ambitious targets, looking at all 3 different scopes of emission categories. Now, this is starting to find its way into the value chain. And you'll start to hear from the agencies. And in this case, we're looking at a quote from Mindshare, which is part of WPP and Group M. Carbon footprint of different media distribution options will increasingly influence where clients choose to make their investments. This is now starting to find its way into the ecosystem. And it manifests itself typically in the RFP and the RFI. So if you're an ad tech company or you're a media company and you are trying to win the budgets of those big brands and those agencies, you are finding a new set of questions in those RFPs and RFIs, not just focused on tell me about your solutions, the audience you can deliver, your technology or your targeting, but now we need all that. We need to make sure that the advertising that we buy from you is going to hit our objectives and our goals. But now you also have to show us what is your approach and your platform with regard to environmental sustainability, and what is the environmental impact of our investment in your business. It's now finding its way into many, many RFPs and RFIs, and lots of companies are now realizing that they need to take action in order to provide accurate data back up to their economic buyers. Second organization we want to talk about is AdNet0. So AdNet0 started out of the United Kingdom about 3.5 years ago as a spinoff from the UK's Ad Association. And it is the industry's collective initiative to decarbonize the production, distribution, and publication of advertising. There are over 200 companies that have joined AdNet0 since its founding 3 years ago, including 100 here in the US. And it includes big brands like L'Oreal, Molson Coors, Indeed.com, all the big platforms like Google, Amazon, and Meta, and all the big advertising agency holding companies, plus several dozen ad tech platforms and media companies. And there's been all sorts of interesting initiatives that have come out of AdNet0. Perhaps the most significant is the Global Media Sustainability Framework. This is a guide, a 40 or 50-page document for advertising buyers of advertising, to apply this framework to ensure that when they are measuring the environmental impact, if they did something like an ad campaign, that it's following a consistent framework from platform to platform, buyer to buyer, seller to seller. AdNet0 is broken out into 5 actions. Action 1 is just looking at emissions that come from business operations. This is going back to making sure that every company in the sector is reporting their third-party verified emissions data and setting their targets and getting, what we like to say is getting their house in order. Second is reducing emissions from ad production. I think a lot of this initiative came from people observing all the waste that goes into something like a photo shoot, where they will send 25 people to Tahiti to take a photograph that ends up in the back page of some magazine, and all the equipment transfer, the catering, the travel that goes into that. Isn't this something that we can make more efficient? So action 2 is all about making production of advertising more efficient. Action 3 is media. If you go back to that supply chain chart that we looked at earlier, how can we figure out ways to eliminate and better quantify data waste in the media supply chain? Because there's lots and lots of waste that goes into ad calls, bid requests, and the data transfer between DSPs, SSPs, ad servers, DMPs. How can we become more efficient and find ways to reduce waste and the subsequent emissions that come from that? Action 4 is events. The ad sector and marketing in general, we love to get on airplanes and fly around the world to meet with people that work right down the street from us. How can we become more efficient about the way that we conduct our events and look at things like swag? Like swag is now something that people are having a whole new outlook on, because a lot of industry event swag ends up in the landfill. So how can we become smarter about that? Everything from that to where the events are taking place to minimize unnecessary travel, to just getting rid of things like plastic water bottles, just simple little things that we can do to make our events less wasteful, more sustainable. And then action 5, which I think is the most interesting, and we're going to talk about in a second, is leveraging the superpower of advertising to support more sustainable behavior, more interesting approaches to consumption and consumer behavior. And that's where the intersection between sustainability and advertising gets really interesting, because everything else we've talked about is really just like taking the same approaches that other sectors have been taking to look at their business operations and say, how can we become more efficient, less wasteful, more sustainable? But we're a unique industry in that we're the industry that's actually responsible for driving consumption and changing consumer behavior. So how can we take all that we've learned on this journey and apply it to the creative messaging that we put out into the universe through our advertising? So that is really the newest and the most interesting of all the actions. And each, by the way, each of these actions has their own working group, and they're gatherings of brands, agencies, and executives throughout the sector that get together and talk about these things and try to get smarter about how they can approach each of the actions. And so I'm going to share with you 4 examples of how you're starting to see this concept of environmental sustainability finding its way into corporate advertising. Example 1, this is a billboard for IKEA, a brand that's already got a real focus on environmental sustainability just with how it produces its products. But they've also now factored it into their marketing message and messaging. So some of you may have seen some of these where they're billboards that are posted on bus stops, and they say this is exactly how many steps it is to the nearest IKEA store, or how to get there by bus, so as to encourage people to either walk or take public transportation, as opposed to getting in their car and driving to an IKEA, which I thought was really interesting. Another one is Heinz Ketchup, biggest manufacturer of ketchup in the United States, encouraging people to grow their own tomatoes and actually providing tomato seeds as part of this initiative to get people to really think about, hey, instead of just buying another plastic bottle of Heinz ketchup and another tomato-based products, should I be growing my own tomatoes? And maybe thinking about, like, how do I source some of the materials of the food that I eat? Perhaps the most famous one is Patagonia's full-page ad in the New York Times many years ago, "Don't buy this jacket." I mean, Patagonia is a company that actually really walks the walk when it does this. They source all the materials responsibly, all of the warehouses and factories that they use to manufacture their products are really just looked at through a completely different scope. Maitri mentioned that I took a corporate sustainability course, and we had a guest speaker from Patagonia that dove into this, and it was fascinating how deep Patagonia goes into its own upstream and downstream supply chains to look at the impact that all that it has on the environment. But they, in this ad, were actually saying, hey, don't buy this jacket. Take the jackets that you have and patch them up. Patagonia has a whole program where you can take a ripped or torn or damaged jacket and get it repaired, so as to not have that jacket end up in the landfill, so you just buy another one. And then the last one that's actually been winning a lot of awards recently is Hellman's is encouraging people to rethink leftovers. And one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions is food waste. Food ending up in landfill is actually really bad for the environment. So Hellmann's has a whole campaign around taking those leftover foods in your refrigerator, mixing up some Hellmann's mayonnaise with some new recipes, and getting more people to rethink and make leftovers more exciting again. And this is a campaign that's, as I said, getting a lot of attention and winning some awards. There's lots more examples and way more to come as this part of Ad Net Zero starts to really take off. But I think it's an interesting intersection between the mindset around sustainability and the creative advertising process. And I think it's a great space to pay attention to because there's going to be some cool other examples on this coming out in the next few years. Okay, so when it comes to corporate climate action, no industry gets a pass, especially not the advertising industry. That's a quote from John Osborne, who was the US director of Ad Net Zero. And we get this a lot. People say, oh, this isn't our problem, it's other industries' problem. No, every industry has to be looking at the impact that its business operations have on the environment. No industry, big or small, gets a pass, and especially not the ad industry. A, because we already know that our numbers are bigger than we previously thought, but B, because we have this connection to all other industries and how consumption and consumer behavior factors into the bigger picture around the impact that we as humans have on the environment. Okay, so if this is something that is of interest to you and you want to get more involved, what are some thoughts on paths that you can take and things that you can do? I always like to start with the circle of influence, right? Wide circle of influence. Go work for a company that takes this stuff seriously. Or join a team or create a team that actually takes it seriously. We're going to talk about all these in just a second. And then you as an individual, what can you do to become the expert and really start to lead by example? And so if you are looking at new companies to go work for and you want to know, well, what is this company's position on environmental sustainability? It's a Google search. You do company name, sustainability, and you're going to see whether or not they have an ESG report or some sort of a corporate sustainability report where they're putting out their greenhouse gas emissions numbers, typically over multiple years. You want to be looking for companies that follow the greenhouse gas protocol and that they've done this in a public and transparent way over several years. And you can find them from all the big corporations. I mean, I've got Clorox, Unilever, and P&G listed here, but most big companies have them, and certainly all the big advertising agencies have them too. You can also go and see, does this company have a science-based target? Are they listed in the Science-Based Targets Initiative's dashboard, sciencebasedtargets.org? Go check out the dashboard and not only see if they're in there, but check out the target and see how does it compare to other companies that are in the space. But then there's actually a bunch of companies that have popped up in the ad sector itself that are really considered to be purpose-based agencies or businesses. Agencies like the Responsible Marketing Agency or Revolt that are helping brands do some of the things we talked about, like Hellmann's and Heinz and Patagonia, to actually work sustainability into their messaging. There's ad networks like the GoodNet that are literally just a collection of media properties that talk about purpose-driven media topics. So if this is something that you really want to go all in on, there's actually a whole bunch of companies out there that might be of interest to you, as opposed to saying, I'm going to go work for a company that's taking it seriously. I'm going to go work for a company that makes this a part of their business. Then start a green team. This is happening all over the ad sector now. And I talk to a lot of these people because what we do at Alpine Project is that we actually help some of these folks that say, we're organizing a team inside of our company because we want to take action, but we don't know what to do. We give them the guidance to actually take the right steps, to conduct a greenhouse gas inventory, to get it third-party verified, to publicly report it with a climate registry, to set a science-based target. And so, but a lot of these companies have groups of people that are doing this as like their extracurricular activities. It's their 20% time. And if there isn't one at the company that you're working for, go start one. And that's where we typically come in and help out and say, all right, you guys have the ambition, you've got the interest, you've got the passion for this subject matter, and you want to take action. That's where we come in and we help them out. Kepler, the lower left-hand box, it's one of the big agencies. They've got a whole Kepler Climate Action Team, the KCAT, and they've done things like food drives and trash pickup days and all sorts of interesting things around getting the rest of the company on board with what is really an initiative driven by, I think, 7 or 8 people inside of a pretty big agency. And then Cargo is one of the big mobile data platforms and media platforms. They've started a group from just with 2 people, and they actually put together a pitch to the CEO that said, we need to have a stance on environmental sustainability because we're getting all those RFPs and RFIs, and we don't have answers to those questions. And they actually went and calculated, like, how much revenue do we think we lost by not having answers to these questions? And they made it a business case. It wasn't a feel-good story. It was a, hey, this is good for business. Let's get our climate action house in order. And so whether you work for a company that takes this serious or not, there's always an opportunity to get involved with a green team. And then books, lots of books on this subject, going from left to right, like very basic kind of high level books like the Carbon Almanac, which was actually written by a marketing guru, Seth Godin. That's a good place to start, all the way to the end on the right, where there's actually a book out now about sustainable advertising by Matt Bourne and Sebastian Munden, who are both very much involved in Ad Net Zero. No shortage of books out there to read up on this subject. And I feel like there's lots of opportunity just to add this to your reading list. And if anybody wants my reading list, let me know, DM me, and I'll send you a couple of ideas of books to read to get started. But then there's other media businesses. Trellis, actually formerly known as GreenBiz, had a podcast for a long time. They've got now a whole media outlet that just covers the latest in climate and environmental sustainability related news. The ENN, ESG Today, Business Green, there's no shortage of resources for the latest news on this subject. I also follow the NGOs. It does get a little wonky and sometimes kind of boring, but just to follow where things are at in terms of regulation and standards and protocols. And then I think maybe most interesting is the events. And there's a lot of different events that are tied to this subject matter, both within the ad sector and then outside it, and then sometimes connecting the dots. You can go to Advertising Week or Cannes Lions or the IAB events. And if you just look at the online agenda and you search for sustainability, there's always going to be a half dozen or so sessions that are covering this topic. And that's what I usually like to do, just to get smarter on the subject matter and hear what other people are doing, is go to a trade event that's not tied to sustainability, but find the people that are talking about it. But there's now other events like the Green Media Summit and the Sustainable Media Summit that are now popping up that are in their 3rd year, where this specific topic, the intersection of sustainability and advertising, are getting discussed amongst ad execs. So lots of things to do there. Anyway, you're getting involved. You're either earlier in your career or you're kind of thinking about ways to change your career. You can start by changing the world daily, no matter how small the action. There's lots of different things you can do to get involved in this subject matter and change the way your industry works and to help transform the industry into one that is more environmentally sustainable. So that is the summary of our presentation, and I want to hand it back to you, Maitri, for some Q&A.
Thanks, Brian. I'm actually going to take it from here to get us kicked off. Just going to quickly. Yeah, so that was great. Thank you so much. As someone who's in the sustainability space, it's really enlightening to see people in advertising and marketing start to take this a bit more seriously. To kick off the fireside chat, I was wondering if we could maybe unpack this scope 3 just a little bit more. And I'm curious to hear, how confident are you in these measurements? Because the data must be hard to access. Like if I'm L'Oreal and I'm going granular to understand how my consumer is using water to use my product, are there assumptions? Like, can you help us understand that process?
Sure. So what we're talking about is something called a greenhouse gas inventory. And a greenhouse gas inventory is a process that a company goes through to produce a report that actually says, okay, this was the environmental impact of 1 year's worth of our business operation and value chain. You are right that it does sound like a pretty daunting task. Like, how do you possibly look over every nook and cranny of a business, particularly in your downstream value chain where there's so much unknown? But that's where the standards, guidelines, and protocols that have been created and have been around for really since the early 2000s and late 90s, those protocols exist so as to make this an easier process for companies to follow. And that is also why third-party verification is so important. This is one of the things that our business does, is that we conduct greenhouse gas inventories for companies, and then we get them verified by somebody else. accredited organizations that exist solely for the purpose of saying, okay, if L'Oreal is going to say that they're responsible for 287,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalents, which is the standard currency for greenhouse gas measurement, how do we know that the data was collected properly? How do we know that the emissions factors were calculated properly? That's where you take something like megawatts of electricity per hour from an office building or a data center and convert it into that standard currency of CO2 equivalents. The answer to your question, Ty, is that the standards, guidelines, and protocols have existed long enough where there's enough of a confidence in the methodology that if you apply those correctly to any business of any size, public or private, and you get it verified by an accredited third party, you're going to come out with a pretty reliable data set and something that you can then share publicly and share with your clients, your partners, but also for any requirements from a regulatory standpoint.
Amazing. Thank you. A question just came in from Rupsha, which was actually on the heels of a question I was about to ask anyways, so a good one. But it's really on greenwashing, and if there's any legislation or structures put in place that can keep companies accountable.
Good question. So there's a statute out of California called AB 1305. And maybe before we get into specific statutes, if we're just looking at the US, because there's a whole other conversation happening with the European Union, there is nothing substantial, really nothing at all in terms of federal climate regulation in the US right now. It's happening at the state level, specifically California, Illinois, New York, Minnesota, maybe one or two others. And the one that I think is getting the most attention is this statute out of California called AB 1305, which basically says if you are a company that makes some sort of an environmental claim, and the one that they really go after is we're carbon neutral. And just so everybody understands, carbon neutral means you've measured your emissions. You now know that your business is responsible for 10,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalents, as an example. You didn't necessarily reduce, but you remove those emissions by buying carbon offsets. You invested in a project somewhere in the world that should be sequestering the same amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that you're responsible for through your business operations. And technically, the definition of carbon neutral means I measured my emissions and I bought enough offsets, so now I've neutralized them. And there's lots of companies that are out there saying they're carbon neutral, but the California AB 1305 says that you still need to show what standards were followed, provide transparency around those projects, because there's definitely some sketchy projects out there that might not necessarily be doing what they say. But most importantly, a third party, an impartial third party, has come in and said what this company is saying is true and accurate, so as to validate, verify, or certify those claims as accurate. And if you get caught not having that third party verification or validation, you can get fined. I think it's up to $2,500 a day for every day that you are putting those messages out there. So there's rules in place, and it's at this point it's just at the state level. There's also similar regulation coming out of the European Union that has similar fines for making the same kinds of claims without having that impartial third party verification.
That was a great question. We were discussing about greenwashing, in fact, right before the webinar. And Brian, my next question is, we spoke a lot about what Net Zero does, and they have this 5-action plan, but how does it actually influence decision making among global ad agencies and not just the US?
Well, so Net Zero has multiple chapters for different regions of the world. It started out of the United Kingdom. It's now got its biggest chapter in the US, but there's also chapters in Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, and a few others that are popping up. And they're each designed to address the issues of each individual region. Now, it's nice to have a trade organization. And one of the critiques of trade organizations, and I think it's somewhat valid, is that they talk a lot, but there's not that much action that actually gets done. And so Net Zero is a trade organization that's actually trying to put some real meat on the bone and try to actually change real behavior throughout the industry. And so one of the things that Net Zero has in place is that if you join Net Zero, and there is a membership fee to join, like there is for any trade organization, you've got 12 months to announce and publicly disclose your company's science-based target. So right out of the gate, you're joining and you've got a year to do something that's actually a pretty rigorous process that's going to come out the other side with your company being listed amongst those other 10,000 that have set a science-based target. And you can't just set a target. You've actually got to conduct your first greenhouse gas inventory, understand what your baseline number is, and then set your target. So from just a membership standpoint, they want every company at a minimum to at least have their numbers publicly reported and to have their targets set. But then when it comes to actually taking action and finding ways to really drive efficiencies and reduce waste, I mentioned briefly what's something called the Global Media Sustainability Framework. That is that project that came from a year's worth of work from something called pre-competitive collaboration, where multiple companies got involved in putting together a big document that explains how a buyer of advertising can measure the environmental impact of a single ad campaign through all the data transfer and the data waste that goes into it.
Right. Wow. So interesting. And I mean, it really, one of the things when I speak to people in finance and I speak to people in marketing, a lot of the times when I bring sustainability issues up, it's right away. Well, there's no ROI on that. It's just a cost sink, like bottom line, blah, blah, blah. I'm wondering if you could, so it's very important for us to kind of generate the business case for these sustainability initiatives and kind of convince corporate finance that there is a return on this. I'm wondering if you'd be able to provide any kind of tangible examples of how these sustainability initiatives have actually generated revenue in ad tech.
Yeah, it's a great question, Ty, and it's something we hear a lot. Like, oh, another regulation I have to live up to, or another hoop I have to jump through. Like, advertising and ad tech in particular is hyper competitive. And these are companies that are fighting tooth and nail, sometimes with multiple competitors just for their own market share. And the last thing they want to hear about is another bunch of processes that they need to go through. But the counter to that is, because we know that their economic buyers care about it, right? Going back to those big agencies and the brands that they represent, going through this process, making public statements around their positioning on environmental sustainability, it becomes what I like to call in ad sales and media sales, another ladder into the castle. It's another way to connect your business to the companies with whom you want to do business. And I'll give you a specific example. I mentioned that I work for a company called OpenX. OpenX is one of the leading omni-channel supply side platforms. It's an SSP, and the SSP category is really competitive. And all the agencies have preferred SSP lists. And OpenX wasn't on all of them when I joined the company. But we went through this journey. We were the first company in the ad tech space to publicly report our verified emissions data, first company to set a science-based target, first one to get certified as carbon neutral. Remember, we didn't just say we were carbon neutral, but we measured our emissions, reduced them as much as we could, and then bought offsets to compensate for the rest. And that carbon neutral certification was something that we shared with the public. We did a press release. Hey, OpenX is proud to announce that we're the first certified carbon neutral company in the ad tech space. And quick sidebar, you're going to hear about several other ad tech companies announcing carbon neutral certification in Q1, because that's one of the things that we do is we help ad tech companies and agencies go through that process. OpenX made that announcement, and not one but two different agencies that did not have OpenX on their preferred SSP list said, we like what you're doing. This is an important initiative for us, and we want to join forces with you. And I can show you the press releases. Havas Media Group adds OpenX to its preferred SSP list because of its position on environmental sustainability and the fact that it's the first certified carbon neutral company in the space. And Havas Media Group and Horizon Media was the other one. So there's proof points 1 and 2 that this is not just a feel-good story. It's not just something that you do because it's important to the CEO. It's actually a way to connect with your buyers. And there's another piece to it that's a little less tangible and maybe harder to tie back to revenue, but it ties back to corporate culture and talent attraction and talent retention. And I didn't share the data for the sake of brevity, but there's been great research done on how people want to work for companies that have a clear and authentic position on environmental sustainability. So you put your plan in place, you publicly disclose your reports, and more people are going to want to come work for you, and they're going to want to stick around.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I'm just pulling up another question here. So, Dimitri, go ahead.
So Brian, you mentioned the circle of influence and going through, what company you can work for, and you mentioned that, you could become part of a team that does that. So my next question is when you're trying to build teams like this or when you're trying to start sustainability initiatives, how can these initiatives be framed to gain buy-in from, skeptical stakeholders or leadership?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll go back to, we touched on this a little bit, but I mentioned a company called Cargo, and Cargo dealt with this exact issue. They had a small group of people inside the business that cared passionately about their company having a corporate climate action positioning statement, but the CEO only cares about, and rightly so, right? He cares about hitting the revenue goals and running a successful business. So they knew they weren't going to necessarily win based on the philosophical benefits or the cultural benefits at the corporate level of having it. They wanted to go in and just go right for the revenue. And so they put together this research project where they looked at all the RFPs and all the RFIs that they got over a year. And they made a pile of all the RFPs and RFIs that had questions tied to environmental sustainability. And 2 years ago, there were none. And now it's almost on all of them. And so they basically said, how many of those where we had to say, the question was, what are your annual greenhouse gas emissions numbers? Have you set a science-based target? Are you a carbon neutral certified company, et cetera, et cetera? We don't know, was their answer to all of them. How much money did they lose by not having better answers to those questions? And they brought that to the CEO, and that got the CEO's attention. And he said, okay, this is something we believe in, and we do want to do it for the right reasons. But now we're doing it for a different reason, which is we need to make sure that it's a way to future-proof our business and to help us grow new revenue opportunities. Now, that's not going to be the case every time. A green team, and I use the green team loosely, they've got different names depending on what company you're at, but you can build your green team and then get executive buy-in lots of different ways. But it always seems like the fastest way to get approval is to show me the money and show me how having this positioning statement and taking it seriously is actually going to connect us to our buyers better and to help us generate new revenue opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Personally, I hope that paradigm changes as all this evolves, that like if the measurement of the bottom line is the dollar bill or finances, then the measurement of the triple bottom line is the value. Because like you pointed out, there is new research showing that Gen Z specifically, as they enter the workforce, they primarily want to work for companies that have mission-driven values. They don't want to jump into the corporate world and do that. They're looking for more from their careers. So it's an exciting time to get into it. One thing you mentioned a couple times that I don't know if people would understand it. Could you explain what an offset is?
Sure. So offsets, also known as carbon credits, sometimes a subset of that would be a carbon removal project. And that is where you are spending money, you're making an investment in some sort of a project. Typically, there's different categories of carbon offsets and carbon credits, but the most common is nature-based projects. So for an example, restoring grasslands in the Mississippi Valley, a piece of land that was otherwise going to be left alone is now going to be refurbished, and the grasslands are going to be growing back because of an investment that was made in that particular part of the world. Okay, the money that goes into the restoration of those grasslands is considered a project because the restoration of those grasslands are going to sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that might be the same carbon that your business is responsible for. And so there's afforestation, reforestation, lots of different ways to implement different types of carbon offsetting projects. And the truth of the matter is that there's definitely some carbon offset projects that are legitimate, they're verified. There's actually a whole system in place and some organizations that are in the business of verifying different offset projects. But then there's a bunch out there that might be a little sketchier. And if you want to go down a rabbit hole, John Oliver did a piece on this on his show and went on a 20-minute rant about how fraudulent a lot of the offset market happens to be. But again, it all goes back to verification, certification, and validation. And if you can show me that this project has had impartial organizations review it, look at it, and verify that it's legit, that is going to be enough to ensure that you're making a smart decision in spending money there. And then again, the whole idea here is that if you want to look at the three fundamentals of corporate climate action, it's measure, reduce, remove. In that order every year. Measure first by conducting a greenhouse gas inventory, reduce as much as you can in that given year, and then remove what is left over by investing in carbon credits and carbon removal and offset projects. Measure, reduce, remove. And then if you want to get to carbon neutral, you got to measure and make sure you remove everything by investing in offset projects that are equivalent to your measured emissions. And then if you want to get to net zero, the SBTI definition of net zero is you go from a baseline year, the first year you start measuring, and you drive a reduction of 90%. And then you only offset what's left over or remove what's left over. So I gave you a little more to your answer there, Ty, but hopefully that is at least is a little bit of an overview of how the offset market works.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's a very complex market, so I know it's difficult to summarize, and I think you did excellent there. On the heels of the marketing summit, the main topic there was AI. And when I asked one of the speakers about their understanding of the downstream impact of AI on the environment, he actually didn't really have much of an answer for me. So I'm wondering if you could provide some information for everyone here. What is the impact of AI on the environment? And should we as marketers and advertisers be aware of that?
Well, I'm not sure, Ty, I'm going to have too much more than the person you asked, but I'll tell you, it is a hot topic in our sector now. It's buzzwords that we love to talk about. AI, sustainability, put them two together, and now you have a 30-minute panel at your next industry event. Here's my take on it. First, if you just look at from the data standpoint, we mentioned that right now, data centers are responsible for about 3.7% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, that number is expected to triple over the next 10 years, and it's going to be AI that drives that. AI requires a tremendous amount of compute, and crypto's in there too. Although I think they're getting smarter about how to do crypto mining in a more energy efficient way, but AI, there's no getting around it. It is going to require a lot of electricity to power the next wave of artificial intelligence. A friend of mine who I worked with, who was the chief technology officer of OpenX, said that environmental sustainability is the roadkill and AI is the truck that drove over it. And I was like, oh boy, that's kind of depressing. Here's the good news, right? First of all, there's a lot of really smart people that are thinking about this and are looking for ways to solve it. But then there's the other side of the conversation, which is that AI, by definition, is supposed to be really good at solving problems. And it is. And there are several companies that I've come across that are now leveraging artificial intelligence to start solving climate-related issues. The easiest way is that it's actually getting better at the greenhouse gas measurement process, which doesn't solve the reduction problem, but at least it helps us get way better and more accurate in terms of measurement and quantification. But I believe that there will be two tracks happening. Yes, AI is going to contribute to the problem, but I also believe that AI is going to contribute to these solutions. And we are really just at the very beginning of what will be an interesting journey over the next decade to see where this goes.
Thank you. Maitri? You're mute.
Sorry. Yeah, we have one last question. And this is something that we were discussing in one of our classes as well. It's called Management of Innovation and Technology. And we were discussing Meta and its privacy policies. And I think something similar applies to this as well, because it's a very innovative space and people are doing so many new things. So my last question to you is, do you think governments should impose stricter regulations on advertising emissions, or should the industry remain self-regulated?
So that's another question that gets discussed a lot in the industry. And I want to make sure we're clear on something. The concept of advertised emissions, right? There's financed emissions, and then there's advertised emissions. These are kind of somewhat abstract topics, right? Financed emissions is if I'm a private equity firm and I invest in 30 companies, the emissions from the money that I invest in those companies has to be quantified and measured. Well, what about if I'm an advertiser and I am in the business of selling SUVs, like the investment that I made to advertise my product, what was the environmental impact from that? So there's all sorts of kind of head spinning abstract concepts that have to be addressed here. But back to the topic of regulation, I don't think we're going to be at a point where there's like a new line item on the greenhouse gas protocols reporting template for advertising. Just so everybody knows, if I'm an advertising company and I have my data centers powering trillions of ad impressions every month, that actually gets filed under something called purchase goods and services. It's scope 3 category 1, because it's a purchase goods and services is usually going to be like Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud Platform. A lot of those are actually getting way better at shifting to more renewable energy. But as far as regulation is concerned, I think with the advent of organizations like AdNet Zero, there's enough happening in the space where I don't want to call it self-regulation, but it's certainly self-awareness, self-action that I think we're going to see a lot of progress there. We are certainly not going to want to wait around for federal regulation because that's going to take a while. And I think that we'll see how deep some of the state regulation goes or some of the regulation coming out of the European Union. But I think that what you'll find is that it's going to be driven more by the economic buyers. I think that if you're looking for where's change going to come from and where does the motivation to change come from, it's more likely going to come from companies that want to be in the good graces of Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Diageo, the companies that pay their bills, more so than staying compliant with some local or federal law. Because I think that just takes longer, and people follow the money, and you're going to start to see ad budgets shift more towards businesses that have their climate action house in order, and that's going to be a bigger driver than regulation.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was a really, really good answer, and thank you so much for this session. I hope all of us learned something great today, and we hope this discussion has sparked new ideas and encouraged you to take actionable steps towards creating a more sustainable future in advertising. And remember, even small actions can lead to significant impact when we work collectively, and that's where your circle of influence comes in. Once again, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today for this insightful session on sustainability in advertising, redefining the future of marketing, and a special thank you to you, Brian, for sharing your expertise and taking us through your journey and inspiring us with practical strategies to drive sustainability in this industry. If anyone has any remaining questions or would like to continue the conversation, please feel free to reach out to us or connect with Brian directly. We will also be sharing a recording of this webinar, so keep an eye out on your inbox. Thank you again for being part of this important dialogue, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Have a great day.